The planet Xyloria was once a place of peace and beauty, a world where its inhabitants, the Xylorians, lived in harmony with nature and each other. The air was always fresh, the oceans were crystal clear, and their cities were marvels of architecture, blending seamlessly with the natural landscape. The Xylorians had never known conflict. Their advanced technology was built not for war, but for exploration, learning, and the betterment of all. Their civilization was one of knowledge and culture, but above all, it was built on peace. But peace, as they were about to learn, is fragile. For months, a shadow had crept across the planet, unnoticed at first. Small skirmishes broke out on the outskirts of the Xylorian colonies. At first, it seemed like a minor issue, a misunderstanding between border colonies or a simple case of theft by outsiders. But soon, the attacks grew larger, and the enemies more ruthless. The Xylorians, who had never faced such aggression, couldn't comprehend the force bearing down upon them. Then came the fleet. At first, the Xylorians believed they were seeing something like a diplomatic mission from another world. Their scanners had picked up massive ships descending toward their planet, and their first reaction was to send out an invitation for peaceful contact. But when the ships made landfall, they did not respond to their peaceful overtures. They launched attacks, brutal, relentless assaults on every city in sight. The invaders didn't seem to want anything from the Xylorians except their utter destruction. Xyloria's once proud defenses were quickly overwhelmed. Their military was built for research, not for defense. They had no weapons capable of facing such an onslaught. The invaders' ships were massive, equipped with technology far beyond anything the Xylorians had ever seen. Their weapons could obliterate entire buildings in an instant, and their ships could move at speeds that made it nearly impossible for the Xylorians to keep up. In just a matter of days, the cities fell. The once thriving urban centers were reduced to rubble, the elegant structures that had stood for centuries now nothing but piles of stone and dust. The peaceful Xylorians, who had never fought for anything in their lives, now found themselves running for their lives, seeking shelter in caves and underground bunkers. The once lush green landscapes were now scorched, the skies filled with smoke and the scent of burning. The air was thick with ash, and it seemed as though their world was being erased from existence. In the midst of the chaos, the Xylorian Council, made up of their wisest leaders, gathered in secret. Their hearts heavy with the weight of their people's fate, they knew that they were running out of time. The enemy was relentless. The invaders weren't just attacking their cities, they were hunting the Xylorians. Entire groups of people were being slaughtered without mercy, their homes destroyed, their culture eradicated. The Council, for the first time, faced a terrifying truth. Their peaceful ways could not protect them. Their knowledge, their wisdom, their technology, none of it could save them from this ruthless force. "We have no choice," the council leader, Laris, said quietly, her voice thick with despair. She had always believed that peaceful negotiations could resolve any conflict, that reason and diplomacy were the keys to survival. But in the face of this overwhelming aggression, she saw no other path. "We must send a message. We must ask for help." The room fell silent. The thought of asking for help, begging for it, was something the Xylorians had never considered. They had always prided themselves on their independence, their ability to solve problems on their own. But now, in the face of total annihilation, they had no choice. They had to reach out, no matter how desperate the plea sounded. The council quickly made their decision. They would send an SOS across the stars, broadcasting their message to any civilization that could hear it. It was their only hope. They couldn't fight this battle alone. The message was simple: we need help. Our planet is falling. We can't survive this alone. It was sent in every known language, hoping that somewhere, someone, would hear their cry. The Xylorians didn't care who answered. They just needed help. They couldn't fight the invaders on their own. They didn't even know who to ask for help, but they had to try. There was no other choice. As the message was sent, the council watched the screens, waiting for a response, praying that someone would hear their plea. The silence in the room was deafening, the tension thick in the air. They had no idea who would respond, or if anyone would respond at all. The vastness of the galaxy felt so empty, so uncertain. They didn't even know if their message had been received. It could be days, weeks, or even months before they knew if anyone was out there. Time was running out. Outside, the enemy's forces continued their relentless assault. The skies above Zaloria were now filled with the thunderous roar of invader ships, each one a sign of their impending doom. There was no escape. The Zylorians could feel the walls closing in around them, their once peaceful world slipping away with every passing moment. Then, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, a signal came through. It was faint at first, almost undetectable. But as the Zylorian communication officers worked quickly to enhance the signal, it became clearer. A voice, distorted at first, echoed through the speakers. The council leaned forward, their hearts racing with anticipation. "We heard your call." The voice was slow, heavily distorted by static, but the words were unmistakable. "Help is coming." A sudden rush of hope flooded the room. The council could barely breathe as they listened intently, waiting for more information, more clarity. Who is this?" Laris asked, her voice shaky with emotion. There was a pause, followed by the chilling words, "This is Commander Ruck of the Deathworlder fleet. We received your SOS. Help is on the way." The room fell silent, a strange mix of relief and fear filling the space. The Zylorians had asked for help, and someone had heard them. But as the name Deathworlder echoed in Laris's mind, a wave of dread swept over her. The name sent a chill down her spine. She had heard whispers of these beings, fierce warriors, known throughout the galaxy for their ruthlessness and their brutal tactics. The Deathworlders were not peaceful. They were not the allies the Zylorians had hoped for. And yet, as the enemy continued their attack, the Zylorians had no choice but to accept this help. Survival was all that mattered now. The voice on the other end continued, and the message was clear: "We will be there soon. Prepare yourselves." The Zylorians had reached out in their moment of need, and they had received a response. It was not the peaceful rescue they had envisioned, but it was a rescue nonetheless. Now, they had to prepare for whatever was coming, knowing that the help they had begged for would not come without a price. The Deathworlders had heard their cry, but what kind of saviors were they? The Zylorians sat in stunned silence, the weight of Commander Ruck's words pressing down on them like a heavy fog. "Deathworlder fleet," Laris whispered, her voice filled with uncertainty. The name alone struck fear into her heart. She had heard rumors of these beings, but the stories were always vague and shrouded in mystery. No one truly knew what the Deathworlders were capable of, except that their reputation was one of terror. If the Zylorians had hoped for peaceful allies, their expectations were shattered in an instant. The communication room was filled with a mix of emotions: disbelief, fear, and a strange sense of hope. The invaders were still out there, still wreaking havoc on their planet. They had no choice but to accept the help that had come, no matter how unsettling it was. The Zylorians had reached out for survival, and survival was what they would get. But the cost of that survival was something they could only begin to comprehend. "We've heard of the Deathworlders," Tarek, a younger council member, said, his voice tight with worry. "They're not like us. They don't come to save, they come to conquer." Laris nodded, her brow furrowed in concern. "We must be careful. We asked for help, but what if it's a trap? What if they're coming for something else? We can't afford to lose everything we've worked for in the name of survival." The other council members looked at each other, their faces drawn with the same anxiety. They had no answers, only questions. The enemy had been overwhelming, and the Deathworlders' fleet was their only hope. But at what price? Would the Deathworlders save them only to claim Zaloria for themselves? The silence was broken by the crackle of the communication system. The voice of Commander Ruck filled the room again, though this time the tone was more direct, more commanding. "We will be landing within the hour. Prepare your defenses. We will make this quick and efficient. The invaders will not have time to retaliate." The message left little room for negotiation. There was no promise of peace, no offer of cooperation. The Deathworlders weren't here to talk, they were here to act. The Zylorians had no choice but to comply. They had sent an SOS, and now, They had to rely on their mysterious saviors, hoping against hope that their intervention would be the answer they desperately needed. As the communication ended, Laris turned to the council with a solemn expression. "We must prepare for their arrival," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "We don't know who these Deathworlders are, but we have no choice. They are our last chance at survival." The council immediately sprang into action, giving orders to their forces to prepare for whatever would come next. The planet was in chaos, the cities burning, and the population in hiding. The Xylorians had never been warriors, and now they had no choice but to adapt. They had to show the Deathworlders that they could be useful, that they weren't just a burden. They needed to prove they were worth saving. As the Deathworlder ships descended from the sky, their massive forms casting long shadows over the planet, the Xylorians could only watch in awe and fear. The ships were unlike anything they had ever seen. Sleek, black, and imposing, their hulls reflecting the dim light of the dying sun. Each one seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, and their sheer size made the Xylorians feel small, insignificant in comparison. The Deathworlders made no attempt at diplomacy. As the ships touched down, their soldiers immediately began to disembark. They were tall, their bodies encased in heavy armor, their movements precise and intimidating. They wore no insignia, no symbols to mark who they were, but their presence alone spoke volumes. These were not peaceful beings. These were warriors. The Xylorians stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They had expected help, but not like this. The Deathworlders didn't come as friends, they came as conquerors. The Xylorians had sent an SOS for salvation, and what they had received was not a peaceful solution. It was an ultimatum: fight or be destroyed. As Ruck stepped forward, flanked by his soldiers, the tension in the air grew thick. His face was a mask of indifference, his gaze cold and calculating. He surveyed the Xylorians as though they were nothing more than pawns in a larger game. "You are alive because we allowed it," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "The invaders are a threat, and we will eliminate them. But you will fight alongside us. There will be no hesitation, no second chances. Do you understand?" The Xylorians stood in stunned silence. They had heard stories of the Deathworlders, their ruthless reputation echoing across the galaxy, but seeing them in person was a different experience entirely. These beings were not here to negotiate. They were here to impose their will. Laris, her face pale but determined, stepped forward. "We will fight," she said, her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. "We will fight to save our people. But we need to know what you want from us." Ruck's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the silence stretched between them. "Your survival," he said simply. "That is the price. Nothing more, nothing less." The words sent a chill down Laris's spine. The Xylorians had not asked for this. They had asked for peace, for help from a race they didn't fully understand. But now, they were faced with the harsh truth. Survival in the galaxy didn't come for free. It came at a cost, and the Deathworlders were making it clear that the price was steep. The Xylorians had been given a second chance, but it was not one they had asked for. As they watched the Deathworlders prepare for battle, they realized that their world had changed forever. They were no longer just peaceful beings trying to survive. They were soldiers, forced into a war they never wanted, and bound to a powerful force that would shape their future. The Deathworlders were here, and whether the Xylorians liked it or not, their survival was now in the hands of these ruthless warriors. The Xylorians had sent an SOS, but the help they had received was far from what they had imagined. The future was uncertain, and all they could do now was follow the orders of their new allies and hope they could hold on to what little remained of their once peaceful world. As the Deathworlder ships powered up, preparing to launch their assault on the invaders, the Xylorians braced themselves for what was to come. The war for their survival had only just begun, and they would soon learn that survival in the galaxy was not as simple as asking for help. It was about being ready to fight, no matter the cost. The Deathworlder fleet hovered ominously over Xyloria, casting long, dark shadows over the smoldering remains of the cities below. The ground rumbled beneath the feet of the Xylorians, and the air was thick with the scent of burning wood and metal. What had once been a peaceful, thriving world was now a war zone, and the Deathworlders were there to ensure their survival. But as they stood before their new allies, the Xylorians couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer in control of their own fate. Ruck, the Deathworlder commander, was a towering figure, his face cold and expressionless beneath his battle-worn helmet. He moved with the precision of someone who had seen hundreds of battles, leading his troops with a sharp, calculating focus. He had already proven his strength, commanding the skies above Xyloria with an iron fist. Now, he was here to ensure that the invaders would not only be defeated but erased. There would be no mercy, and the Xylorians, whether they wanted to or not, would have to fight alongside them. The Xylorian leaders gathered nervously in front of the Deathworlder soldiers. Leris, the council leader, stood at the forefront, her hands clenched at her sides, the weight of her people's future heavy upon her shoulders. She had been a diplomat all her life, a negotiator who believed in peace above all else. But now, she was being forced into a war with beings who did not value peace, who valued only survival. And the cost of that survival, as she feared, might be the loss of everything the Xylorians held dear. "Your city is secure, for now," Ruck said as he surveyed the gathering. His voice was rough, like the growl of a predator, his words carrying a finality that left no room for question. "The invaders will not take it again. But you will not stand by while we fight. You will help. You will learn to fight, or you will be left behind." The Xylorians exchanged uneasy glances. Many of them had never held a weapon in their lives. They were peaceful people, content to build and create, not destroy. But as the Deathworlders' cold gaze swept over them, they understood that the time for peace was gone. There was no room for diplomacy in the world they now found themselves in. Only strength would keep them alive. Leris took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "We will fight," she said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty in her heart. "We may not be warriors, but we will do what we must. Our people will stand with you, as we have no other choice." Ruck gave her a slight nod, as if he had expected her answer. "Good. The training begins now." The Xylorians were led away to makeshift training grounds. They had no idea what to expect. The Deathworlders wasted no time in throwing them into the thick of things. The first lesson was simple but brutal: how to hold a weapon. The Xylorians had been given simple laser rifles, their unfamiliar weight foreign in their hands. The Deathworlders barked at them, showing no mercy as they instructed the Xylorians in the basics of combat. Lyra, a young Xylorian who had never once held a weapon before the invasion, stood nervously at the back of the group. She had seen the horrors of war, the destruction of her home, the deaths of her friends and family, but she had never imagined that she would be forced to fight. She had always believed in peace, in finding solutions without violence. But now, with the Deathworlders pushing her forward, she knew that if she didn't learn, she would not survive. "Focus," barked one of the Deathworlder instructors, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. "If you hesitate for even a second, you die. Move, or I'll show you what happens when you don't." Lyra gripped the rifle tightly, trying to remember the commands given to her. The weight of the weapon was too much, too foreign to her. Her hands shook, and her breath came in short, anxious bursts. She had always known peace, and now she was being forced into a life of violence. But there was no other choice. The instructor marched over to her, noticing the hesitation in her posture. He grabbed the rifle from her hands and adjusted her stance. "You want to live," he growled. "You learn how to fight. I don't care about your fears. I care about you staying alive." The harshness of his words sent a chill down Lyra's spine. She had never been this close to death before, but now, with each lesson, each movement, she realized how real it was. Her entire world had been turned upside down. The peaceful life she had known was gone, and in its place was a brutal struggle for survival. As the training continued over the next several days, the Xylorian skills began to improve, though the change was slow. They were not born to fight, and each step was painful. The constant drills, the endless hours spent learning to aim, shoot, and defend, wore them down, but they had no choice but to push forward. Every moment they spent training felt like a step further away from the people they had once been. In the distance, the battle raged on. The invaders were still out there, still determined to take control of the planet. The Deathworlders continued their relentless assault, their warships taking out enemy positions with brutal efficiency. For the Xylorians, it was a strange, surreal experience. They were supposed to be the defenders of their world, but now, they were learning from those who had no concept of peace, only of war. One evening, Lyra sat on the steps of the Council's temporary base, exhausted and drained from the day's training. Her rifle lay beside her, her hands too tired to even grip it. Her mind was clouded with thoughts of her family, of the life they had lost. She had wanted to be a scientist, to explore the stars and make a difference through knowledge. But now, all she could think about was how to survive. "You're thinking too much," came a voice from behind her. She turned to find Ruck standing there, his shadow looming large in the dimming light of the evening. His cold eyes seemed to pierce right through her, like he was studying her every move. "I can't stop thinking," Lyra said, her voice tight with frustration. "I don't want to be here. I never wanted to be a soldier. I just want things to go back to the way they were." Ruck stood silently for a moment, then spoke, his voice low. "You can't go back. You asked for help, and now you must learn to live in this new world. The universe doesn't care about your ideals, your dreams. It only cares about survival. And survival comes with a price. The sooner you understand that, the easier it will be." His words were cold, but they struck a chord deep within her. He was right. This wasn't the world she had wanted, the world she had known. But this was the world they were in now. The question was, could they adapt to survive in it? The next day, the battle took another turn. The Deathworlder fleet had launched a full-scale attack on the invaders' base, their ships firing with deadly precision, obliterating everything in their path. The Xylorians, under the Deathworlders' watchful eyes, were thrust into the fray. Lyra gripped her rifle, her legs shaking as she prepared to fight alongside her new allies. The battle was unlike anything she had ever imagined, a cacophony of gunfire, explosions, and shouts. But as she fought, a small part of her realized something important. Survival was no longer just about saving her planet. It was about surviving the galaxy's brutal realities. This war had changed everything for her, and she was starting to understand that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant adapting to a world that demanded strength, ruthlessness, and sacrifice. The Xylorians had begged for help, but in doing so, they had unleashed something much darker than they had imagined. The Deathworlders had come to fight, and now, the Xylorians would learn that their salvation came at a far greater cost than they could have ever anticipated. The battle had escalated in intensity, and the Xylorians found themselves caught in the eye of a storm they hadn't prepared for. The Deathworlders had proven their worth, ruthless, efficient, and unyielding in their mission to wipe out the invaders, but the Xylorians were beginning to feel the weight of what they had unleashed. What they had begged for. The Deathworlders, as their saviors, had saved them from annihilation, but they had also changed everything. The very fabric of the Xylorian identity was being torn apart by the sheer force of this brutal intervention. Lyra stood among her fellow soldiers, her weapon heavy in her hands, her body aching from the hours of combat training. Her eyes scanned the battlefield, watching as the Deathworlder warships continued their barrage from above, unleashing a constant rain of destruction on the invaders. The invaders' defenses were no match for the superior weaponry of the Deathworlders, but the Xylorians weren't just onlookers. They were now part of the carnage, forced into a war they never wanted to be in. They had been turned into soldiers, and the price for survival was becoming clearer by the second. The once peaceful people of Xyloria now fought side by side with the very beings they had never imagined they would ever meet. These Deathworlders, who had shown them no mercy in their training, were now their allies in this fight for survival. The Xylorians, despite their fear and their hesitation, fought to protect their planet, but as they did, they were becoming more like the Deathworlders. Cold, detached, unfeeling. It was as if war had infected them, and they were no longer the peaceful beings they once were. Ruck, the Deathworlder commander, stood at the front of the assault, his armored figure leading the charge. His voice cut through the chaos of the battlefield, sharp and commanding. "Focus. Move forward. Eliminate the threat. Nothing else matters." His soldiers obeyed without question, moving like a well-oiled machine. There was no hesitation, no mercy in their actions. They were there to win, and that was all. The Xylorians, though reluctant, were forced to fall in line. They had no choice. If they didn't follow the Deathworlders, they would fall, just like their cities had fallen. The pain of watching their world crumble beneath the boots of invaders was still fresh, and now they were forced to fight back or perish. Lyra clenched her rifle tighter as she followed the Deathworlder soldiers. The pain of the past few days was still with her. The images of destroyed homes, the faces of the dead, the memories of the peaceful life she had once known. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to fight. But as she watched her fellow Xylorians, their faces hardened with the same resolve, she realized that they had no choice but to fight. They were fighting for their world, for the last shred of what made them who they were. "Move," barked a Deathworlder sergeant, pulling her back into focus. "You're too slow, Xylorian. Keep up." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she moved forward, pushing through the dread that threatened to overwhelm her. She had learned, just like the others, to fight, to survive. The Xylorians had become something they never thought possible: warriors. But there was something else, something deeper that disturbed her. Despite the growing strength in her arms, despite the training, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was being lost within her. She was no longer just Lyra. She was Lyra the soldier, Lyra the fighter, Lyra the survivor. But who was she beyond that? Ruck's voice crackled over the comms. "The invaders are weakening. Push forward, finish them off." The Xylorians, now part of the Deathworlder assault, followed suit. Their movements were smoother now, more natural. They had shed the hesitation that once defined them. They were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting to win, to prove that they could hold on to what little they had left. But as they marched forward, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that she was not just fighting the invaders. She was fighting herself. She was fighting to hold on to the part of her that still remembered peace, still remembered the Xyloria that had existed before the war. The invaders' forces were retreating, their morale shattered under the unrelenting attack of the Deathworlder fleet. But Ruck was not satisfied. The fight was not yet over. "We don't leave any survivors," he commanded. "Eliminate them all." Lyra's stomach twisted. She had heard of Deathworlder tactics, their no-mercy approach to war, but she had never imagined being part of it. She had never imagined being the one to pull the trigger, to end a life. But the situation left no room for hesitation. The Deathworlders had made it clear. Survival came with a price, and that price was paid in blood. As she followed her squad into the final push against the invaders, Lyra saw the faces of her fellow soldiers, their expressions hard as they fought with cold precision. The Xylorians, once pacifists, had adapted to the brutal tactics of the Deathworlders. They were becoming soldiers in every sense of the word. And though the war was nearing its end, Lyra couldn't escape the fear that the true battle had just begun. The Deathworlders might have saved them from destruction, but the Xylorians were beginning to realize that in doing so, they had lost something far more precious than their homes. They had lost their innocence, their ideals, and perhaps even their soul. As the last of the invaders were wiped out, Ruck stood at the front, surveying the battlefield. The victory was theirs, but Lyra couldn't find peace in it. She had fought for her people, yes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the price of their survival was too high. They had been saved, but in saving them, the Deathworlders had shaped them into something new, something darker. "Survival is what matters," Ruck said, his voice as cold as ever, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "You've done well, but remember, this is not the end. The galaxy is full of enemies, and you will face them again. When that happens, you will need to be ready. You will need to be like us." Lyra stood in silence, her weapon still clutched tightly in her hands, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth. The war for Xyloria was over, but the war for her people's soul had only just begun. The Deathworlders had given them survival, but at what cost? The Xylorians had asked for help, but what they had received was something much darker than they could have ever imagined. They had been saved, but they had also been transformed. And as Lyra looked out at the burning remnants of the enemy's stronghold, She realized that no matter how the war ended, nothing would ever be the same again. The victory was theirs, but the taste of triumph felt bitter in the mouths of the Xylorians. They had fought alongside the Deathworlders, had bled for their survival, but something fundamental had shifted in them. They had been shaped by war, forced to adapt to a brutal reality that stripped away everything they had once known. Their peaceful, harmonious world was gone, and in its place stood a fractured society, one torn between the survival instincts they had been forced to adopt and the remnants of their old selves that longed for peace. The city of Xyloria, once a gleaming beacon of civilization, lay in ruins. The once beautiful landscape, now scorched by the fires of war, seemed unrecognizable. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble, the skyline marred by the presence of Deathworlder warships hovering overhead. The Xylorians had won, but the price of that victory was steep. Lyra stood on the edge of a destroyed building, her eyes scanning the remnants of the city. She could still remember the days before the war, when she and her fellow Xylorians would walk through the city streets, admiring the natural beauty of their world, their society built on knowledge and cooperation. But now, there was nothing left of that peace. The war had torn through it all, leaving only the bitter reality of survival behind. The Deathworlders were still there, their fleet stationed above, their soldiers moving through the streets, securing areas, and ensuring that no remnants of the enemy remained. The Xylorians, now trained in combat, were forced to continue working alongside their ruthless saviors, following orders and learning how to be warriors. The training had been grueling, and though the Deathworlders had shown them how to fight, they had also made it clear that survival was not a gift, it was a transaction. The Xylorians had been saved, but they were now bound to the Deathworlders by the debt of survival. Lyra was still struggling with the enormity of what had happened. She had fought, yes, but she had also lost something. Something deep inside of her. She had been forced to become someone she never wanted to be. Someone capable of killing, of destroying, of fighting in a war she hadn't asked for. And now, she wondered if there was any way back to the peaceful world she had known. Could they ever return to who they had been? Or had they become something else entirely? Lyra! A voice called out behind her. She turned to see Tarek, one of the younger members of the council, rushing toward her. His face was pale, his eyes filled with the same uncertainty she had seen in her own reflection. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice shaky. Lyra nodded slowly. "The invaders are gone, but I don't think we can ever go back to what we were. Not after all of this." Tarek looked down at the ground, his expression filled with the same quiet frustration. "I thought we'd be different. We were supposed to be different. But now, we're soldiers, just like the Deathworlders." A heavy silence fell between them. Lyra wanted to reassure him, to tell him that there was still hope, that they could rebuild, that they could find peace again. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. They had been changed by this war, and no amount of rebuilding could undo the transformation they had undergone. They had been forced into a brutal reality, and no matter how hard they tried to hold on to the past, the world they had once known was gone. "Maybe we're not supposed to go back," Lyra said quietly, the words catching in her throat. "Maybe we're supposed to move forward, into something new." Tarek looked at her, his eyes filled with confusion. "What do you mean? How can we move forward when everything we were is gone?" Lyra took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I don't know, Tarek. I don't know what happens next. But I do know this. Survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about holding on to what makes us who we are, even if we have to change to do it. We've lost our peace, but we haven't lost everything." Tarek looked at her, as if considering her words, but the uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. I don't know if we can rebuild. I don't know if we'll ever be the same." Lyra turned away from him and looked out over the city once more. The sky above was still filled with the dark shapes of the Deathworlder warships, their engines humming softly. The Xylorians had won, but at what cost? The Deathworlders had kept their promise. They had defeated the invaders, but they had also forced the Xylorians to face the harsh truth of their world. There was no peace left. There was only survival. As the days passed, the Deathworlders began to withdraw, leaving behind a planet that was still too broken to function on its own. The Xylorians, though they had survived the war, found themselves in a strange new world, one where their past seemed both distant and irrelevant. They had learned to fight, to survive, but the question still hung heavy in the air. What now? What was the point of survival if they had lost everything that had made them who they were? The Xylorians began the long process of rebuilding, but the journey was a painful one. They were no longer just scholars and builders. They were soldiers, survivors, and they didn't know how to reconcile the two. The Deathworlders had shown them the ways of war, but they had also shown them how fragile their peaceful existence had been. They had come to Xyloria to ensure survival, but they had also forced the Xylorians to live in a world where peace seemed like a distant dream. And so, as the Xylorians slowly rebuilt their cities and their lives, they also began to rebuild themselves. They were no longer the people they had been before the war. They were something new, something born of survival. But Lyra wondered, was that enough? Would it be enough for her people to find a new way forward? Or would they forever be haunted by the memories of the world they had lost? The Deathworlders had taught them the value of survival, but they had also shown them how costly it could be. And now, the Xylorians had to decide what kind of future they wanted to create, knowing that the scars of the past would never fully heal. Would they forge a future based on the lessons of survival? Or would they find a way to reclaim what they had lost? And if so, at what cost? The answer was unclear, and the journey ahead was uncertain. But one thing was certain. The Xylorians would never be the same. They had been saved, but they had also been changed. Now, they had to learn to live with the consequences of their survival. The dust from the battle was still settling across Xyloria, and the scars of the war were deep. The Deathworlders had left their mark on the planet, not just with their weapons, but with their presence. The Xylorians, once a peaceful people, had been thrust into a world of violence, and though the invaders were gone, the consequences of that violence were far from over. They had been saved, but the price of survival was one they could never undo. Lyra stood in the midst of the wreckage, looking out over what was left of her once beautiful world. The remnants of the Deathworlder fleet still hovered in the sky above, their warships a constant reminder of the ruthless intervention that had turned the tide of the war. The sound of their engines, once a terrifying roar, had now become a distant hum, a grim, ever-present soundtrack to the new reality the Xylorians had to face. It had been weeks since the battle ended. Lyra was still struggling with the enormity of what had happened. She had fought, yes, but she had also lost something. Something deep inside of her. She had been forced to become someone she never wanted to be. Someone capable of killing, of destroying, of fighting in a war she hadn't asked for. And now, she wondered if there was any way back to the peaceful world she had known. Could they ever return to who they had been? Or had they become something else entirely? Lyra! A voice called out behind her. She turned to see Tarek, one of the younger members of the council, rushing toward her. His face was pale, his eyes filled with the same uncertainty she had seen in her own reflection. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice shaky. Lyra nodded slowly. "The invaders are gone, but I don't think we can ever go back to what we were. Not after all of this." Tarek looked down at the ground, his expression filled with the same quiet frustration. "I thought we'd be different. We were supposed to be different. But now, we're soldiers, just like the Deathworlders." A heavy silence fell between them. Lyra wanted to reassure him, to tell him that there was still hope, that they could rebuild, that they could find peace again. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. They had been changed by this war, and no amount of rebuilding could undo the transformation they had undergone. They had been forced into a brutal reality, and no matter how hard they tried to hold on to the past, the world they had once known was gone. "Maybe we're not supposed to go back," Lyra said quietly, the words catching in her throat. "Maybe we're supposed to move forward, into something new." Tarek looked at her, his eyes filled with confusion. "What do you mean? How can we move forward when everything we were is gone?" Lyra took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I don't know, Tarek. I don't know what happens next. But I do know this. Survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about holding on to what makes us who we are, even if we have to change to do it. We've lost our peace, but we haven't lost everything. Tarek looked at her, as if considering her words, but the uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. I don't know if we can rebuild. I don't know if we'll ever be the same. Lyra turned away from him and looked out over the city once more. The sky above was still filled with the dark shapes of the Deathworlder warships, their engines humming softly. The Xylorians had won, but at what cost? The Deathworlders had kept their promise. They had defeated the invaders, but they had also forced the Xylorians to face the harsh truth of their world. There was no peace left. There was only survival. As the days passed, the Deathworlders began to withdraw, leaving behind a planet that was still too broken to function on its own. The Xylorians, though they had survived the war, found themselves in a strange new world, one where their past seemed both distant and irrelevant. They had learned to fight, to survive, but the question still hung heavy in the air. What now? What was the point of survival if they had lost everything that had made them who they were? The Xylorians began the long process of rebuilding, but the journey was a painful one. They were no longer just scholars and builders. They were soldiers, survivors, and they didn't know how to reconcile the two. The Deathworlders had shown them the ways of war, but they had also shown them how fragile their peaceful existence had been. They had come to Xyloria to ensure survival, but they had also forced the Xylorians to live in a world where peace seemed like a distant dream. And so, as the Xylorians slowly rebuilt their cities and their lives, they also began to rebuild themselves. They were no longer the people they had been before the war. They were something new, something born of survival. But Lyra wondered, was that enough? Would it be enough for her people to find a new way forward, or would they forever be haunted by the memories of the world they had lost? The Deathworlders had taught them the value of survival, but they had also shown them how costly it could be. And now, the Xylorians had to decide what kind of future they wanted to create, knowing that the scars of the past would never fully heal. Would they forge a future based on the lessons of survival? Or would they find a way to reclaim what they had lost? And if so, at what cost? The answer was unclear, and the journey ahead was uncertain. But one thing was certain: the Xylorians would never be the same. They had been saved, but they had also been changed. Now, they had to learn to live with the consequences of their survival. The dust from the battle was still settling across Xyloria, and the scars of the war were deep. The Deathworlders had left their mark on the planet, not just with their weapons, but with their presence. The Xylorians, once a peaceful people, had been thrust into a world of violence, and though the invaders were gone, the consequences of that violence were far from over. They had been saved, but the price of survival was one they could never undo. Lyra stood in the midst of the wreckage, looking out over what was left of her once beautiful world. The remnants of the Deathworlder fleet still hovered in the sky above, their warships a constant reminder of the ruthless intervention that had turned the tide of the war. The sound of their engines, once a terrifying roar, had now become a distant hum, a grim, ever-present soundtrack to the new reality the Xylorians had to face. It had been weeks since the battle ended, looking out over the city once more. The work of rebuilding had begun, but the true rebuilding, of their people, of their hearts, had only just begun. There was hope, still. There was always hope, but it would take time, and it would take all their strength to rebuild not just their homes, but the very soul of Xyloria. They had been saved, but now they had to find a way to save themselves. The days following the council's meeting passed slowly. Xyloria, once a paradise of peace and tranquility, was now a battlefield, both physically and emotionally. The invaders were gone, but the scars they had left were deeper than any weapon could inflict. The Deathworlders had done their job, driving off the enemy, ensuring the survival of the Xylorians, but now the planet's true battle had begun. The Xylorians had to face the reality of their new world, a world where survival was no longer guaranteed. The death and destruction that had become a daily part of their existence had changed them. They were no longer the peaceful, curious people they once were. They had become warriors, forced into combat, pushed beyond their limits by beings who knew nothing of peace. Lyra felt the weight of this every time she looked out over the city. The foundations of their world were being rebuilt, but the heart of it, the spirit that had once defined them, felt lost. The Xylorians had been forced into survival, but now they had to figure out what came next. What kind of future could they build from the ashes of their past? Each day, more people were being trained. There was no choice. The Deathworlders insisted on it. They had brought order to the chaos of the battle, but they had not offered the Xylorians any sort of guidance on how to live in this new world. That responsibility fell squarely on the Xylorians' shoulders. It was time to learn to live with the realities of what had happened, to face the brutal truths that their once peaceful society had been destroyed by war. Lyra stood in the makeshift training grounds, surrounded by her fellow soldiers, trying to push through the exhaustion of the day's drills. She gripped her rifle tighter, trying to steady her shaking hands. The weapon felt heavy, as if it carried not just the weight of her own survival but the weight of her people's survival, as well. She had learned how to fight, how to kill, but the truth of it was sinking in. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for her identity, for the future of the Xylorians, and that made the stakes much higher. Tarek, who had stood by her side during the worst of the war, approached her. His face, like hers, was hardened by the constant battles and the never-ending training. But there was something in his eyes, a glimmer of doubt, of fear, that Lyra had seen before. "Lyra," he said, his voice quiet, "do you ever wonder if it's worth it? All this training, all this fighting. I mean, we've won. But look at what we've become. I'm not sure who I am anymore. I'm not sure who we all are." Lyra turned to him, her heart aching at the familiar pain in his voice. She knew exactly how he felt. She had been questioning herself every day since the Deathworlders had arrived. They had asked for help, but in return, they had been forced to give up more than they had ever imagined. "I don't know," she replied, her voice thick with uncertainty. "But I know this. We're still here. We've survived. And survival isn't just about living. It's about what we do with what's left. We've lost our peace, Tarek. We've lost the world we knew. But we haven't lost ourselves. Not yet." Tarek looked at her, as if trying to find the same spark of hope she had managed to hold on to. But it wasn't easy. Their world was in ruins, their people were scarred, and the Deathworlders, though they had saved them, had done so with a cold, brutal efficiency. It was hard to see a future when the present felt so suffocating. "We'll rebuild," Lyra said, though even she wasn't sure what that meant anymore. "But we have to decide what kind of world we want to build. A world that's more than just survival. More than just fighting." Tarek nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "I hope you're right. I hope we can find a way to bring back what we lost." The two of them stood there for a moment, lost in their thoughts, before they were called back to the drills. The noise of the Deathworlder soldiers, barking orders and demonstrating their cold, efficient tactics, reminded them that their fight wasn't over. The war had ended, but the consequences of it, of what they had become, were just beginning. Weeks passed, and the Xylorians found themselves living in a strange new world. They had won the war, but it felt as if the true battle was only beginning. Rebuilding their cities was the easy part. Rebuilding their hearts, their souls, what made them Xylorians, was another matter entirely. Lyra had been appointed as a leader of one of the training units, tasked with guiding the younger, less experienced soldiers. They were all survivors, but none of them knew what they were surviving for. The Deathworlders had taught them how to fight, how to endure, but they had not taught them how to heal, how to reclaim the essence of who they were. For Lyra, that was the hardest part of the war, the part that left the deepest scars. One afternoon, as she walked through the rebuilt streets of Xyloria, she saw a group of children playing in what used to be the center of the city. They were laughing, their faces lit up with the carefree joy that had once defined her people. They were the future, the generation that had not known the horrors of war, the generation that would one day carry the weight of rebuilding. Lyra stopped, watching them for a moment, a lump forming in her throat. The future of Xyloria was now in the hands of these children, but she wondered, what kind of future could they have in a world that had been so irrevocably changed? Could they ever return to the peace that had once defined their culture, or would they, too, be shaped by the violence they had witnessed? "Lyra," Tarek called, approaching from behind. "We've been called to a meeting with the council." She nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. The council, she knew, would once again be grappling with the same questions that had haunted her for weeks. What comes next? The Deathworlders had taught them how to survive, but they hadn't taught them how to live. They had shown them that peace was fragile, and survival was a constant struggle. As she followed Tarek toward the council chambers, Lyra felt the weight of their uncertain future pressing down on her once again. They had survived the war, but what kind of world were they rebuilding? What would Zaloria become in the aftermath of all the destruction and bloodshed? The council meeting was already in progress when they arrived. The leaders of the Zylorians were seated around a long table, their faces filled with the same exhaustion that had settled over Lyra's heart. There was no joy in the victory they had won, no sense of triumph. There was only the endless, weighty question. What now? Laris, the council leader, looked up as Lyra and Tarek entered. "We have much to discuss," she said, her voice heavy with the burden of leadership. "We have survived, but we must now decide what kind of future we want. The Deathworlders have taught us how to fight, but we need to decide how to rebuild, not just our world, but ourselves." Lyra stepped forward, her mind racing. "We cannot rebuild what we had, but we can build something new. A world where survival is only part of the equation. A world where peace is not just a dream, but a possibility." The council members nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. But in that moment, Lyra felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The road ahead would be long, and the scars of war would never fully fade. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way for the Zylorians to rebuild, not as they had been, but as something stronger, something more resilient. It would take time, and it would take strength. But it was a future worth fighting for. The days seemed to blur together for the Zylorians as they continued to rebuild their world. The Deathworlders had come and gone, leaving behind their lessons of survival, their brutal efficiency, and a lingering presence in the form of their warships still stationed above Zaloria. Though the war had ended, the scars, both visible and invisible, remained. For Lyra, the days were spent moving between the training grounds, overseeing drills, and trying to help those who had been affected by the violence of the past weeks. Her role as a leader was still new to her, but it had become clear that, in the absence of true peace, the Zylorians needed something to hold on to, a purpose, a direction. But each day, as she walked through the makeshift barracks and rebuilt streets, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling of a deep divide. The people of Zaloria were surviving, but were they truly living? The planet was coming back to life, homes were being rebuilt, fields were being replanted, and structures once destroyed were slowly rising again. But what about the spirit of the Zylorians? What had become of their culture, their values? Lyra could see it in the faces of the people. They were doing what they could to survive, but the peace they had once taken for granted now seemed out of reach. There was a hardness in their eyes, a wariness that had never been there before. The Deathworlders had taught them how to fight, but they hadn't taught them how to heal. And the cost of that, of becoming something they had never wanted to be, was taking a toll. One morning, Lyra found herself standing on a hill that overlooked the capital city. The construction work below was relentless, with Zylorians working to rebuild the foundations of their civilization. It was progress, yes, but it didn't feel like the world they had once known. The laughter of children that used to echo through the streets was replaced by the sounds of hammers and machinery. The peaceful hum of daily life had been replaced by the grinding noise of survival. A hand on her shoulder broke her from her thoughts. Tarek stood beside her, his face etched with the same concerns that had plagued her for weeks. "I've been thinking," Tarek said, his voice quiet, "about everything we've lost. We're rebuilding the city, but we're not rebuilding ourselves. I don't know if that's possible anymore." Lyra met his gaze, feeling the weight of his words. She, too, had been thinking about the same thing. They had survived, but at what cost? The Zylorians had become soldiers, forced into a new reality by the Deathworlders, and now they had to find a way to move forward. But how could they? The life they had once known seemed so far removed from the people they had become. We can't go back, Lyra said softly, looking out at the city. We've lost too much. But we still have a choice. We can choose how we move forward. It's not easy, but maybe this is our chance to rebuild something different. Something stronger.